alongside a righteous man. But she couldn't leave her judgment behind. The command was clear. Heaven had spoken. Do not look back. But she looked. And in that instant, something inside her was revealed. It was just a glance, but a glance can be a sentence. Her body turned to salt, her soul. A frozen memory. Why did she look? What was there in Sodom that she couldn't let go of? And what if today that same spirit is still among us? What would cause you to become a living statue? Today, you're going to understand why Jesus didn't say, "Remember Lot," but instead, "Remember Lot's wife." I'm Eliam, and you're watching Shadows of Scripture. Today, you're going to hear the story of the woman who defied God's command and turned into a statue. But first, subscribe to the channel, because what you're about to hear isn't just a memory, it's an eternal warning. Lot's wife is never introduced by name. The Bible doesn't mention her genealogy, record her words, or highlight a single act of faith from her. She appears in the story only as Lot's wife, but that's not a meaningless detail, it's a central point. In biblical culture, names are tied to identity, purpose, and spiritual legacy. And the fact that she walks through a story of judgment without receiving a name suggests she left no legacy before heaven. No faith is recorded, no cry, no obedience. But before the judgment came, there was a journey. And to understand it, we need to go back. Lot was Abraham's nephew, and he walked with him from the time they left Haran. He took part in those first steps of obedience, witnessed the birth of the promise, and walked through unknown lands, trusting God's guidance. His wife was with him from the beginning. She was part of the family that had left everything to follow a calling. But time revealed differences. While Abraham kept building altars and listening to the Lord's voice, Lot began to follow what he saw with his natural eyes. When the time came for them to part ways due to the prosperity of their herds, Lot chose the plains of the Jordan. Fertile land, visually appealing, but close to Sodom. Scripture is clear. He pitched his tents toward Sodom. He didn't go straight into the city. He moved closer, and his wife followed. She was part of this geographical shift that little by little became a spiritual one. First they were on the outskirts, then inside. Eventually, Lot sat among the city's leaders. Sodom was known for its perversion. Not just sexual immorality, but injustice, pride, oppression, and mockery of everything holy. It was a city at war with heaven, even as it prospered in the eyes of men. Lot's wife lived in that environment, and apparently, she got used to it. There's no record of her reacting to the city's corruption. No sign she was bothered by what she saw. No record of prayer, reverence, or resistance. She simply became part of Sodom's daily life. We can imagine her routine. Taking care of the home, her daughters, engaging in social life, shopping at the markets, forming relationships. She might have been respected, integrated, functional, but spiritually, she was asleep. Lot, according to the Apostle Peter, was still tormented by what he saw in Sodom. His soul was distressed daily, but his wife doesn't seem to have had that same reaction. And that's revealing. Because living next to someone who still fears God doesn't replace personal fear. Living with someone who hears God's voice isn't the same as obeying it. She was married to a righteous man, but that didn't make her a spiritual woman. And when the time of judgment came, the contrast became clear. The angels arrived in a hurry, with a direct order and a set date for destruction. And inside Lot's house, they found hesitation. Scripture says Lot and his family lingered. The angels had to take them by the hand. Lot's wife was among those pulled out by mercy, but not because she was ready. She was taken, dragged, not by faith, but by divine insistence. That's the setting. A woman who started her journey alongside the promise, but ended without identity before God. A woman who knew the path, but allowed the city to shape her heart. And that was enough to seal her fate. Sodom was a strategic city, located in an economically advantageous region with fertile land near the Jordan Valley. It attracted many seeking material prosperity. It wasn't a remote village or a marginalized tribe. It was a well-established urban center, connected to the trade routes of its time, involved in business, agriculture, and cultural activity. But along with all of that, it became one of the most spiritually corrupted places in biblical history. Sodom's reputation was known long before divine judgment came. Scripture itself says, "The men of Sodom were wicked and great sinners against the Lord." This wasn't just about isolated moral transgressions, but an entire culture built on contempt for God's laws. The city had institutionalized wickedness. Sin was no longer the exception, it was the system. It wasn't just a people who made mistakes. It was a society that celebrated those mistakes as a way of life. Perversion was public, accepted, and defended. The power structures were corrupt. Social relationships were based on pleasure, gain, and domination. There was no fear, no restraint, no shame. It was a place where right had become laughable and wrong was promoted as virtue. This environment didn't destroy visitors by force. It slowly pulled them in. It offered convenience, apparent safety, and a twisted kind of freedom. People got used to it, stopped resisting, and started mimicking the local patterns, often without realizing it. Lot's wife arrived in the city with her husband. She wasn't born there, but she chose to stay. And over the years, Sodom stopped being just the place she lived. It became the place she identified with, not because of ideology, but out of habit. She wasn't known for scandals. There's no record of direct involvement with pagan rituals or profane practices, but there's also no sign of resistance, devotion, or spiritual vigilance. She lived like someone who didn't see the danger of being distant from God's presence. What Scripture shows is that when judgment came, she wasn't ready, not spiritually, not emotionally, because her conscience had already been shaped by her environment. This is what happens when someone stays too long in a corrupt place without resisting its influence. At first you ignore, then you tolerate, then you imitate, and before you know it, there's no clear line between what you believe and what the world promotes. The city had shaped her tastes, her behavior, her priorities. She no longer thought like someone from a family of promise. She thought like someone who saw Sodom as normal, acceptable, even desirable. The problem wasn't just living in Sodom. It was allowing Sodom to become her reference for life. It was treating that city's standard as the measure of comfort, safety, and fulfillment. The corruption that God decided to judge, she had accepted as normal. And that put her on a collision course with the divine will. It wasn't Sodom's sin that destroyed her. It was her lack of discernment in realizing she was already a part of it. When the angels arrived in Sodom, they came with a clear mission: to remove Lot and his family before the city was destroyed. The situation was urgent. Wickedness had reached an irreversible point. The sentence had already been declared. Sodom was marked for judgment, and the destruction wouldn't be symbolic. It would be literal. Fire and sulfur would fall from the sky. But the destruction of the city wasn't heaven's only focus that day. There was also one last chance for salvation, and it would be offered clearly. The angels didn't give long explanations or leave room for debate. They gave a straightforward command: get up, leave this city, flee for your lives, don't look back. Don't stop anywhere on the plain. Flee to the mountains or you will die. This wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't a metaphor. It was a life or death instruction. At that moment, the time for conversation was over. It was no longer about understanding. It was about obedience. The warning was direct, final, and without compromise. And among all the instructions, one phrase stood out for its spiritual weight: don't look back. That command might sound strange by modern standards. But in biblical contexts of judgment, looking back wasn't just a physical gesture. It was a symbol of emotional, spiritual, and moral attachment to what was being destroyed. God didn't just want them out of the city. He wanted them out with a clean heart, to leave behind everything Sodom represented: its values, its memories, its attachments, its desires. Don't look back was a dividing line between those who would simply change locations and those who would truly break with the past. Lot's wife heard that command. She was there when the angels spoke. She was reached by the same mercy. She had access to the same deliverance. Yet even so, the gesture she would make later would reveal something deeper. She wasn't just leaving Sodom. She was struggling to stay connected to it. The command was clear, but her reaction would be revealing. Because before God, the simplest gesture can carry the most serious judgment. On the morning the angels arrived in Sodom, everything still seemed normal. The city was functioning as usual. The markets were busy, the leaders were at the gates, the homes in order. Nothing, to the human eye, suggested that this would be the last day of that civilization's existence. But in heaven, the sentence had already been given. When the angels appeared, they didn't present themselves as supernatural beings. They took the form of men, as was common in other angelic visits in the Bible. Lot recognized them, not by appearance, but by discernment. He knew they weren't ordinary travelers. He ran to meet them, bowed down, and insisted they stay in his home. In that culture, hospitality was a sign of honor, but here it was also a form of protection. He knew leaving them at the mercy of the city meant putting them in real danger. And the danger showed up almost immediately. Men from all parts of the city surrounded the house. They didn't come to talk. They came to take the visitors by force, to violate the sacred. Sodom's wickedness was no longer hidden. It was public, collective, shameless. And when sin becomes a consensus among many, divine judgment doesn't hold back. It draws near. Lot tried to reason with them. He even offered his own daughters in a desperate attempt to protect the guests. But the men mocked him. They called him a foreigner and threatened to harm him too. That's when the angels intervened. They pulled Lot inside, shut the door, and struck the attackers with blindness. Now there was no doubt judgment was certain and destruction was imminent. The angels then revealed the purpose of their visit. They had come not only to announce Sodom's destruction, but to remove the few who could still be spared. And they were direct. Take your family and leave. The city is going to be destroyed. But the biblical text makes it clear that Lot lingered. There was hesitation, confusion, perhaps fear. His wife and daughters also didn't show immediate initiative. The city around them was wicked, but still, it was familiar. It was their home, the place where they had built bonds, routines, stories, and leaving all that behind all at once was harder than it seemed. So the angels took them by the hand, literally a gesture of divine intervention, of absolute urgency. They were dragged out of the city by God's mercy, not by the readiness of their hearts. But the instruction didn't stop there. After getting them out of the city, the angels said, "Flee for your lives. Don't look back. Don't stop anywhere on the plain. Flee to the mountains or you will die." This command was clear. It left no room for doubt. It didn't come with theological explanations or emotional justifications. It was an order and a dividing line. As a scribe, I recognize the pattern. God gives clear instructions when the time for reflection has passed. When the moment of judgment arrives, obedience becomes the only acceptable response. And in this specific command, there was something deeper than logistical instruction. The "don't look back" wasn't just geographical. It was spiritual. It was a demand for complete severance, because physically leaving Sodom was one thing. Emotionally breaking with Sodom was another. That phrase carried the weight of a choice, to remain connected to what God was judging or to break away completely. For Lot's wife, that command would be more than a directive. It would be a mirror, because the act of obeying or disobeying would reveal not just her behavior, but her true allegiance. The departure from Sodom didn't happen in a calm setting. Heaven had already decided. The smell of smoke mingled with the dry desert wind, and the first signs of judgment appeared in the distance, as if the horizon itself were breaking. Lot's family walked in haste, guided by the angels who had torn them from the city. Each step was a break from everything they had known, but also a silent test of obedience. The command had been clear: flee for your lives. Don't stop anywhere on the plain. Don't look back. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a life or death command. What was about to happen couldn't be looked at with nostalgia or curiosity. It was destruction. It was judgment. The body needed to leave, but the heart had to separate completely. Lot's wife was there, beside her husband, behind her daughters. She had been reached by the same mercy, pulled out by the same divine hand. She was no longer in the city, but she had not yet been freed from it. That difference is crucial. Physically outside, spiritually bound. She heard the command, knew the gravity of the moment, but what she carried inside hadn't changed at the same pace as her feet. And this is where the story becomes revealing. The look she gave wasn't an automatic act, nor an instinctive reflex. It was a gesture that revealed the inner self. When she turned her head, she didn't just disobey. She exposed the place where her heart still lived. In my perception as a scribe and witness of the Spirit, this moment is more than a narrative detail. It is the instant when judgment changes targets. Until then, judgment was aimed at Sodom. By looking back, she declared her attachment to what was being destroyed. God doesn't judge only external actions, He weighs internal loyalties. And in that second, her look became a confession. It wasn't pure longing or compassion. It was connection. It was belonging. The result was immediate. She turned into a pillar of salt, frozen between two worlds, the one God had already condemned and the path He offered as an escape. Salt in Scripture symbolizes covenant, preservation, purity. But here, it becomes a sign of rupture, a monument of warning. It wasn't an impulsive punishment. It was a revealed diagnosis. She didn't just look back. She identified with what God was judging. That's why she became an eternal symbol that partial obedience saves no one. And I, Eliam, can't tell this without seeing the reflection of this story in our time. How many today walk away from Sodom with their feet, but keep returning with their eyes? How many claim to follow God, but nurture a longing for a world that heaven has already decided to destroy? Lot's wife didn't stumble, wasn't dragged back, didn't make a speech. She simply looked, and the look revealed the soul. The gesture, seemingly small, became a sentence. Because before God, it's not just where we are that matters, but where we are looking. Lot's wife became a pillar of salt. The phrase is short, but the meaning is deep. The Bible doesn't go into detail about how it happened. It doesn't describe the exact moment her body hardened, whether there was a scream or if those beside her reacted. It only says she looked back, and as a direct consequence, she was transformed. This kind of judgment doesn't happen by accident. It's a direct response to the command that had been given before. The angel spoke clearly. Don't look back. She looked. Not by accident, not out of distraction, but by choice. And in that gesture, she revealed that her heart hadn't left the place her feet had already escaped from. The transformation into salt carries symbolic weight. Throughout Scripture, salt appears as a spiritual element. It was used in sacrifices, in covenants, in rituals that marked commitment between God and His people. Jesus would later say that we are the salt of the earth, meaning that which preserves, that which prevents corruption. But there in that scene, salt became a witness of rupture. It wasn't a sign of covenant, it was a sign of judgment. She preserved nothing. She was preserved as a warning. Her petrified image doesn't point to faith, but to consequence. A woman who had access to deliverance, who was reached by grace, but who, at the decisive moment, revealed her true allegiance, not with God, but with Sodom. That statue, even lifeless, speaks. It speaks to those who walk halfway, who obey outwardly but remain inwardly tied to the world. It speaks to those who move toward God out of fear of judgment, but not out of love for truth. The petrification of Lot's wife is more than an isolated event. It is a divine response to what is hidden in the heart. Because heaven is not impressed by movement. Heaven responds to direction. And on that day, she was moving toward the mountain, but desiring the streets of the city. As a scribe, I understand that this scene is not just historical. It is eschatological. Jesus mentions it when speaking about the last days. Remember Lot's wife. It's not a random quote. It's a call. He is saying there will be people in the final days who will also be leaving Sodom, fleeing the system, trying to escape collapse, but still carrying inside them the values that God has already decided to judge. And these people won't be recognized by how far they walked, but by where they fix their eyes. The pillar of salt is, to this day, a symbol that delayed obedience is disobedience, that a half-break is total resistance, that when God calls it's not enough to leave. You must break. Break with sin, with desire, with attachment, with memory. Because those who insist on carrying Sodom in their hearts end up stopping along the way. And those who stop along the way, even after they've started, become statues, motionless bodies, facing a past that heaven has already left behind. The road ahead of Lot and his daughters remained open, but behind them, the world they knew was collapsing. They couldn't go back, not out of fear but by command. There was no time for mourning, no room for explanations. The woman who had been walking with them just moments earlier had now ceased to be a companion. And even so, they didn't stop. They continued as they were instructed, with their eyes fixed in the direction heaven had pointed. That, to me, is one of the most uncomfortable parts of the story. The silence. The steady step despite the pain. The fact that there was no pause, not even to grieve the one left behind. Because when God says go, there is no room to negotiate with feelings, and as they move forward, perhaps still in shock, carrying a mix of obedience and loss, the inevitable question began to echo, not spoken aloud, but felt deep in the soul. Why did she look back? Why, even with judgment before her eyes and mercy just a few steps away, couldn't she just keep going? The answer isn't in the feet, nor in the eyes, but in the heart. And that's what we need to talk about now. The problem of Lot's wife didn't begin when she looked back. The look was only the visible symptom of an old disease, rooted deep in the soul. The true conflict was inside her, and that conflict wasn't born on the road. It was born in Sodom, and had been fed by years of silent coexistence with everything God detests. Because collective sin doesn't settle only in politics or culture. It seeps into habits, into words, into celebrations, into the small gestures of daily life. And when we live too long with sin as the norm, something within us begins to see it as tolerable. That's what happened with her. Sodom wasn't just the place she lived. It was the environment that shaped her affections. She woke up every day under the atmosphere of the city. Neighbors, parties, business, social norms, everything there pulsed in opposition to heaven. And yet she settled in. There are no signs of resistance, no record of her crying out for justice. She was the wife of a man who remained righteous, even though weakened by his surroundings. But she herself shows no sign of discernment. No words, no intercessions, no lament, only attachment. And that attachment grew inside her, until at the moment of separation, it spoke louder than obedience. Invisible attachment is the most dangerous kind, because it's not easily detected. You can leave Sodom in a rush, with an angel pulling you by the hand, with judgment falling behind you, and still be bound. Because the prison is no longer in the walls, it's in the desires, in the unfinished dreams, in the emotional ties, in the inner references that keep trying to convince you there was still something good there. And this is the hardest part. She didn't look back because she wanted to see what was happening. She looked because she longed for what was being left behind. She couldn't imagine starting a new life far from that world. As a scribe, I cannot ignore what this story reveals about our generation. Never has it been more common to see people trying to walk with God while dragging into their faith the shards of a life that heaven has already condemned. People who want to live in obedience, but keep negotiating memories, behaviors, language, habits that should have been left behind at the moment of decision. It's as if a partial gospel were being preached, where salvation is received, but separation is ignored. And those who insist on this live in the same tension as Lot's wife, walking with their feet, but looking with their heart toward what can no longer be part of the journey. Looking back wasn't just a break of command. It was a public confession of unresolved attachment, and God treated it with the seriousness the situation required, because a divided heart in times of judgment becomes an accomplice to its own collapse. She wasn't judged for nostalgia, but for allegiance. Her soul was still committed to Sodom, and those who remain emotionally tied to what God is judging end up judged with it, even if they've already started to walk away. When Lot's wife was pulled out of Sodom, she was no longer inside the walls. She no longer smelled the market, nor heard the cries of the crowd. She was physically far from the destruction. The fire hadn't fallen yet, but the city was already condemned. Heaven had given an order. The angels were already acting, and her distance from the judgment increased with each step. But it was exactly in that distance that deception set in. The false sense of security, the illusion that because she was out of the immediate reach of the flames, she was already safe. And this is the silent danger many don't perceive. Judgment doesn't respond to geography, but to the heart. Lot's wife believed she could relax. She may have thought, I already left. I already escaped. I'm beside the righteous. I've done enough. But enough is not defined by comparison to others. It is defined by full obedience to what God commands. And she did not obey completely. She obeyed the route, but not the posture. She followed with her feet, but not with her loyalty. Thinking you are safe while still ignoring instructions is the deception that has paralyzed multitudes. And this is one of the sharpest messages of this episode. You can be almost out and still be struck. As a scribe, I see this clearly in our days. We are surrounded by people who have already left many sins behind, who have broken with old practices, who have distanced themselves from the world in part, but who, in practice, live as if the danger had already passed. People who lessen their fear, who negotiate small deviations, who slow their vigilance because they believe the worst is already behind them. And in that spiritual relaxation, the old desires return, the old affections return, and with them, vulnerability returns. Lot's wife was near salvation, but she fell under judgment. She wasn't judged because she was in Sodom. She was judged because Sodom was still in her, and because even outside, she allowed herself to believe that judgment no longer applied to her. The danger to her was already over. And it was exactly there, in that feeling of, I'm already out, that heaven interrupted her journey. And this is the warning. Spiritual safety is not measured by distance from the city, but by faithfulness to the command. As long as there's an order to keep going, to flee, to not look back, judgment is still in progress. And only when God says it's over, is it over. Until then, any deviation, any distraction, any self-deception can be fatal. Lot's wife stopped because she thought she had already overcome the hardest part. But the hardest part wasn't leaving the city. It was leaving herself. Lot's wife didn't run back to Sodom. She didn't shout against God. She didn't confront the angels. She simply looked. A subtle gesture, almost imperceptible, but deeply revealing. And that says a lot about how heaven interprets obedience, because to human eyes, she seemed to be on the right path. She was with her family, far from the city, walking in the same direction as the righteous. But what God was evaluating wasn't the external movement, it was the internal disposition. The problem wasn't the distance traveled. It was the resistance still living inside her. This kind of disobedience is the hardest to discern because it manifests in silence. It's obedience that continues on the outside but questions on the inside. That submits in appearance but holds hidden reservations. It's the divided heart, the soul that walks only as far as its understanding allows. And when God's command goes beyond that limit, the crisis begins. Lot's wife didn't reject the path, but she refused to break completely. And that hidden refusal, that silent resistance, was enough to interrupt her salvation. I see this more clearly today than ever. There is an entire generation walking with God on the surface, while carrying inside themselves structures that refuse to fully submit. People who sing, who declare faith, who join movements, but who inwardly maintain areas of resistance. Inner places where they still want control, still want to evaluate, still want to decide what to surrender and what to preserve. And it's this kind of incomplete faith that puts lives at risk, because before God, it's not enough to be on the path. You must be whole. If this message spoke to you, hit the like button. It helps this word reach more lives. Share it with someone who needs to hear this today. And in the comments write, I will not look back, to seal this as a choice before heaven. If you're not subscribed yet, subscribe now and turn on the notification bell. Every week, a new episode, a new confrontation, a new calling. And remember, obedience isn't about understanding everything. It's about trusting, even when everything inside you wants to stop and look back. See you in the next episode, here on Shadows of Scripture.